I said, my name's Emily. I am the founder CEO of Shine Registry. We're organizing this event today and so excited to have you all here. Shine Registry is a platform for folks who are starting businesses and new ventures to ask for the things that they need in the style of a wedding registry. And so this all comes from the idea that if you could ask for a gravy boat when you're getting married, there's all this stuff that you need when you're starting a company or going through a contingency plan with your company, like a lot of our users have been doing over the past few months. You need that support from your community, and so we're building out this community care platform for folks to do just that. When you go to Shine Registry today and you want to support somebody, you can go to our full registries page. And I today am going to be supporting Samantha Watkins. She might look familiar because you might see her on your screen, and you'll be seeing a lot more of her on your screen after I get through this spiel. But supporting folks on Shine Registry is as easy as finding a profile, reading through the things that they are looking for. I know I'm gonna be really excited to endorse and recommend Sam on LinkedIn after this event because I'll have a lot to say about how great this workshop is. And I'll be sharing CEE social media content. And I think I'm just gonna do like I got a technicality. I feel like I've already done this. And so I'm gonna select that as well and click fulfill. And so from here, I'm just confirming that this is all stuff that I am committing to help Samantha grow her business. And I'm fulfilling that. And that's just taking me back to this page with a little thank you note. Some of the things that we're really excited about the new site are increased storytelling capabilities for our users, increased crowdfunding capabilities, and also more space for our partners to be showcased in different parts of the site. For folks who are here with us today, we're going to try to keep you in the loop. We'll be sending a note as we start to launch those new features. But that's enough of Shine Registry. I'm going to pop a link to Sam's Shine Registry profile in the chat. And when you have time, either after today's event or some other time, we really appreciate you supporting her through her Shine Registry profile. But I think that's more than enough of me talking. And I'm so excited to talk about emotional intelligence. I think a lot of people saw our newsletter this week calling all emotional entrepreneurs and maybe appreciated that sentiment that it's hard sometimes to struggle to balance your emotional needs with your business needs, especially in emotionally turbulent times that we're living in now. So I'm really excited to be here for Sam's workshop. Thanks. Take it away, Sam.
All right. Hi, everybody. So excited to get started. I'm glad everybody's interested in this topic. I saw somebody in the chat said they were an empathy enthusiast. Me too. So excited to meet you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get set up a little bit here. So is everybody seeing my screen? Yeah, cool. And then I'm going to have the chat open. So if you have any questions, oh, that's really awesome, Coach Ebony. I really hope that you can relate to what I'm talking about then. So I'm going to have the chat open. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in at any point, and I will do my best to answer them and not get too distracted by the chat at the same time. Also, right before we start, I'm going to put my email and my LinkedIn in the chat if my computer will function. There we go. In case anyone has to leave early, you are welcome to contact me after this event with any questions about anything I talked about today or anything I didn't talk about today, entirely up to you. So anyways, hello everybody and welcome to Emotional Intelligence in Startups. My name is Samantha Watkins. I am the CEO and founder of the Center for Empathy Education, also called C, a professional development provider focused on bringing empathy and emotional intelligence into the workplace. I'm a University of Pittsburgh graduate, and a fun fact about me is that in my free time, I make collages. Today, I'm going to be giving you an introduction to my work with C, focusing on the startup ecosystem. Just to get a feel, could everybody put in the chat whether they are a founder, startup employee, investor, or something else? Thank you, Emily. Shocking that one was. Okay, so a lot of founders here today. Awesome. Then this should be very relevant to you all. So going on, we are going to accomplish 4 learning objectives today. By the end of the workshop, you will be able to, 1, identify behavior that falls into the category of emotional intelligence. 2, implement strategies for emotional intelligence into your daily practices. 3, locate emotional intelligence deficits in your workplace. And 4, create an emotional intelligence improvement plan for your business. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. So to frame our conversation, I want to stress the importance of emotional intelligence to startups. Here we have the top 6 reasons that startups fail according to Forbes. Of these 6, the 5 in dark blue can all directly be linked back to emotional intelligence deficits. I'll get more into the specifics of that momentarily, but first I'd like to define emotional intelligence. It is also referred to as EQ or EI. I will be saying EQ, it is just my personal preference. There are many definitions out there, varied based on discipline and time period. So today we'll be working with what the Center for Empathy Education considers emotional intelligence. EQ can seem very broad and nebulous, so to mitigate that, our definition breaks down emotional intelligence into 4 categories: self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and relationship management. I'm going to go term by term and provide the definition, key related skills, and some examples of it in practice. So first, self-awareness is the ability to identify your emotions, thoughts, and values, recognize how these influence your behavior, and accurately assess your strengths and limitations. The key skills listed are the skills I coach individuals on to develop this component of emotional intelligence. If you're familiar with cognitive behavioral or dialectical behavioral therapies, these might seem very familiar. For self-awareness, the key skills are internal emotion identification, self-reflection, and mindfulness. Yes, I would be happy to share the slides afterwards. If you email me, or maybe Emily can just send them out to everybody, entirely up to her. So what this looks like, self-awareness, it can look like practicing mindfulness, it can look like naming your emotions, or incorporating self-reflection into your routine. It can look like a million other things too, but these are 3 really great ways to incorporate more self-awareness into your day. And I think those will just be a good touchstone to think back to whenever you're trying to define self-awareness. Consider these are things you can do to integrate more self-awareness into your day. With self-regulation, this refers to the ability to regulate your emotions, thoughts, and behaviors across situations, effectively manage stress, control impulses, and self-motivate, and to set and work towards goals. The key skills are emotion regulation, distress tolerance, motivation, and behavior modification. This looks like taking a step back when strong emotions arise, practicing self-care, and communicating your needs. Oh, now it doesn't want to go forward. There we go. Social awareness is the ability to take the perspective of others, empathize with others, and to understand social and ethical expectations for behavior. The related skills are external emotion identification, empathy, and organizational awareness. Wow, it really does not want to go through these slides. Okay, this looks like fitting behavior to the situation, practicing empathy, which it's 2 words, but it's taken me years to know what that means. So that is definitely a huge topic we can unpack a little bit more later on, and considering other points of view. And finally, relationship management is the ability to facilitate effective interpersonal interactions, create healthy bonds with others, communicate clearly, listen effectively, work with others, ask for and offer help appropriately. And the key skills are interpersonal effectiveness, communication, and conflict management. This looks like practicing active listening, rereading emails, and leading collaboratively. I just want to touch on the rereading emails, why I included that as part of relationship management. So this can be both rereading emails that you receive to ensure that you're understanding what people are saying to you. It can also mean rereading emails before you send them to make sure that you're saying exactly what you mean to say. I include this because I've noticed that, especially during quarantine, we're all so busy, we don't do this as much as we could, proofreading our own work, and it's leading to a lot of miscommunication, which is damaging relationship management. So I think that's just a little 10-minute practice that everybody can add in during their day. So to tie this all together, I'm going to give you an example. Imagine you work at a small startup in the fintech space. Your coworkers, Alex, who is on the business side, and Kim, who is on the tech side, begin to argue heatedly over something that everyone else perceives as trivial. You, as the supervisor, have to step in. You want to be mindful of practicing emotionally intelligent management in this scenario, so how do you proceed? Well, first, you want to be self-aware. Notice how you're feeling in response to the tension in the room, the pressure to lead, whatever you may be feeling, observe and acknowledge it. Next, practice self-regulation. Determine how you want to proceed without being driven exclusively by those emotions, but also without ignoring them. To be socially aware, think about what language is appropriate to use in the situation. You're not going to diffuse this fight the same way you diffuse fights between your toddler nephews. And to manage the relationships, identify and respond to the individual needs of all parties involved. Does anyone have any questions about that example? Okay, so next we're going to get a little interactive. We're going to look at a couple examples, and I'm going to ask just one person to unmute for each example and match it to the category that it belongs to. So in our first example, your coworker has recently experienced a loss and you express your condolences without prying into their personal life. Can one person please unmute and volunteer which category of emotional intelligence does this fall into? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Sure, the chat also works.
My guess would be social awareness.
Yes, absolutely. So this would fall into social awareness because it involves recognizing appropriate social boundaries. In the second example, your coworker makes a comment and you observe that it makes you angry and that you respond to this anger. Maybe by wanting to write them something rude or to badmouth them at the water cooler, or maybe to just laugh about it with your partner when you get home. One way or the other, you feel the urge to react. What element of emotional intelligence is this observation? Self-awareness, thank you, Yancy. By recognizing your emotions and how they drive your urges, you become more self-aware because you're reflecting on how your emotions are driving you. In our third example, you have to ask your boss for an extension on a deadline. So this one is a little tricky. It's not as obvious as the other two. So I recommend thinking about which of these categories are internally focused and which are externally focused, and determine whether this scenario is more internally or externally focused. Self-regulation is a good guess, and it's definitely in that neighborhood, but actually is relationship management, because by asking your boss for an extension rather than not submitting the work or submitting inadequate work, you're maintaining the trust in that relationship. It comes from a place of self-awareness in that you must recognize that you need an extension and acknowledge your limits, but the act of involving your boss goes back to that relationship management. But thank you. And in our final example, you start setting personal daily goals. The answer might be a little obvious here, but which emotional intelligence category would this fall into?
Self-regulation.
Wonderful, thank you. It is self-regulatory because it is part of regulating behavior, managing stress and impulses, and self-motivating. All right, so unless anyone has any questions, I'm going to move back to the top 6 reasons that startups fail. So looking at the 5 in dark blue, they could all connect to any component of EQ, depending on the context. But to make really clear the impact of a lack of EQ, I'm going to identify the most likely culprit of the 4 for each scenario. The most common problem causing 42% of startup failures is no market need. This actually indicates a lack of social awareness. It means that the founders didn't talk to their customers to figure out what they actually needed, or perhaps did talk to them but didn't really listen. This indicates a lack of EQ because someone with higher levels of social awareness will be able to use their listening and communication skills to understand the needs of others. The third most common cause of startup failures is not having the right team, which comes back to relationship management. EQ, specifically relationship management, should be integrated into a startup from day one in the choosing of a team and down the road in hiring practices. The fourth reason is getting outcompeted, which is a social awareness issue once again. Not acknowledging your competition indicates a lack of listening to both customers and to the competitors. It may also indicate a lack of self-awareness if this came from a place of hubris, but I wanted to give the companies in the study the benefit of the doubt. And fifth, we have pricing. Again, social awareness is at the root because they're not listening to their customers, not empathizing with their wants and needs. All of these social awareness problems can be avoided by intentionally practicing empathy towards your stakeholders and using self-reflection to identify your own biases in a situation. Finally, we have the problem of a poor product, which comes down to self-awareness. Self-awareness in this scenario would enable the founders to recognize the truth of their situation and really inspect the quality of their work. So, as you can see, startups really do need these emotional intelligence skills to be successful. A startup that is successful in the area of emotional intelligence will usually be identifiable by its cohesive team, strong communication structures, unified front in approaching its mission, ability to listen to its stakeholders, and its positive workplace atmosphere. A startup that is unsuccessful in the critical area of emotional intelligence will stand out for its siloing between different departments. Siloing refers to when departments become so self-involved that they stop communicating with one another. They become individual pillars and they don't connect anymore. And this will most often appear as siloing between business and tech elements in the startup space, but it can happen between any departments. You'll also recognize emotionally unintelligent startups as not having established HR practices early on, especially looking at conflict resolution. They'll make assumptions about their stakeholders, and they will often have a competitive atmosphere. So clearly you want your startup to be more like the one on the left than the one on the right. Next, I'll talk about how to facilitate that, but first I want to get a feel for everyone's experience with EQ in startups so far. Every organization has EQ successes and EQ gaps, so reflecting on your experience, does anyone see anything on the left side, the successful side, that describes their organization or one they've worked at before? Don't be shy, there's a lot of discussion coming up, so feel free to start now.
A startup company that we had, the dues were definitely all of that, which I'm happy to say.
That's wonderful. Does anyone see anything on the right side, the struggling with EQ side, that describes their organization or one they've worked at before? I know this one can be a little more awkward to talk about. All right, well, hopefully you've all had wonderful startup experiences, but if any of these do feel familiar, don't worry, we're going to get into it a little bit more later. Next, we are going to talk about emotional intelligence as it applies to the individual, with the goal of finding EQ strategies that you can bring into your daily practices. So does anyone have any ideas about the possible consequences of a lack of EQ on the individual level? As in, what happens when a founder lacks EQ?
Burnout.
Burnout is a huge one. Thank you for bringing that up. I actually don't think I have it on my little slide after this, but burnout cannot be undersold. Any other ideas?
I would say a lack of consistency.
Absolutely. When you say a lack of consistency, do you mean for the self or as part of the team?
Both, as the founder and as a part of the team.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen that be an issue, and that can really cause difficulties for the rest of the team when someone is inconsistent, especially in what work they're able and willing to do. So a few other consequences of the lack of EQ on the individual level, it can lead to ineffective leadership and ineffective leadership style. difficulty communicating, a sensation of personal disconnect from others, entitled or arrogant behavior, and a lack of drive, which can lead to a lackadaisical attitude or, in the extreme, absenteeism. But absolutely also burnout, absolutely also inconsistency. The consequences are bountiful. This is just a distillation of a few. If you recognize yourself in any of these statements, you may be experiencing personal EQ gaps. Here is the process to fill in those gaps. So start by identifying the gap as specifically as possible, as in not just what the symptom of the problem is, not just how it's impacting you, but what is causing the problem. And then take intentional action to behave differently. Try out different techniques, experiment, see what works for you, and then reassess and repeat until you're satisfied with your skills. Of course, no one is ever perfect. We will all always be able to find EQ gaps. So this process is most helpful when you're finding that those gaps are impacting a part of your life. So we're going to move on to an example, looking at a startup professional's typical morning and trying to find opportunities for greater emotional intelligence. Here we have the professional schedule. You can see they commute into work, which now may mean waking up, walking the dog, and logging into the computer, but regardless, they get to work. They get their coffee, check their email, have a meeting, talk to a teammate, work for a while, and then take their lunch. So let's look at each stage through the lens of emotional intelligence. First, while commuting, they can practice their self-awareness by driving mindfully. This means really paying attention to the present, the act of driving, to the sensation of it, rather than being off in la-la land. Anytime you make the effort to be present, you're developing your self-awareness and by extension, your EQ. When people talk about being present, they often talk about meditation or things like that. And those are absolutely very valuable options. But it can also be as simple as just taking a breath and going, what do I feel in my body right now? What are 5 things I can see, 4 things I can hear, 3 things I can touch, 2 things I can smell, and 1 thing that I can't stop thinking about? It can be very, very simple to just be mindful in a moment. Upon their arrival at the office, they can greet the door person rather than breezing by. This plays into their social awareness. It could also include relationship management if they develop a relationship with the individual that they greet every day. While getting their coffee, they can take a moment to set their goals for the day. This will help them self-regulate, which you recall involves time management, goal setting, and self-motivating. When answering emails, they can build relationships by being sincere, friendly, open. Rather than diving right in, maybe they say, I hope you had a lovely weekend. It's a small thing that some people will brush right by, but for others, those micro efforts can really make a difference. In their department meeting, they can practice social awareness by taking the perspective of their peers. The actual process of perspective taking is kind of time consuming to explain, but in essence, it is the practice of thinking about things from someone else's point of view. This can be incredibly helpful in situations like meetings where personalities bump into each other and issues have to be considered from all sides. After the meeting, they might follow up with a teammate. To conduct some relationship management, they might do things like to encourage connection, like referencing a point that their teammate had made in the meeting or giving positive nonverbal cues to indicate that they are listening and invested. When they sit down to work, they exercise their self-regulation by controlling their impulses and focusing on the task at hand. And finally, at lunch, they can practice self-awareness by reflecting on their day so far and planning for the afternoon. So I'd like to hear from one person, possibly 2. What other opportunities to implement emotional intelligence do you see in this schedule? Because there are a lot of options. I've just given you a couple of the obvious ones.
One thing that I try to do that's been helpful for me is to take like mindful moments, even if it's just deep breathing for like 10 breaths. If I'm feeling tense, like, or the anxiety or feeling tense in my body, which happens a lot now. So even taking like those 10 breaths or like 1 minute, I'll sometimes even set like a timer. It's been really helpful for me personally with the self-regulation, I guess that would be.
Yeah, that's really awesome. That would be some self-awareness and self-regulation. Depending on what you emphasize, the distinction between the categories doesn't matter that much. It's just a way to understand a very large and complex topic. I don't know why I'm drilling into it so hard. I think that's a great idea. Everybody should be doing mindful minutes, especially, when you get home at the end of the day and your shoulders are just killing you and it's because you spent all day hunched over at your desk. It's like, if you could just take 2 minutes a day where you just sit up and go, oh, right, I can breathe when I sit like this, you'll feel just so much better at the end of the day. It's fantastic what a little mindfulness can do for you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our third learning objective, locating EQ gaps in your team. So can anyone guess what are the possible consequences of a lack of EQ on the team level? For collaboration, absolutely. That is a huge one and one of the most apparent. That's definitely a symptom that people can see very, very clearly. Frequent conflict also, very much hand in hand. These types of breaking down trust, absolutely. All of these go together really well. And well, they go together really poorly and kind of make things awful, which is bad, but go together well in the sense that they're all complementary in their own bad way. So this is important, EQ at the team level, because the lack of EQ can translate to difficulty retaining team members, ineffective communication, which leads to missed opportunities and conflict, a sense of disconnect between teammates, a lack of innovation, which inhibits growth and returns, and at its extreme can create a toxic, hostile atmosphere that hinders effective teamwork. All of this can directly impact a startup's ability to achieve its goals and further its mission. The problems can drive a new company into the ground. So now I'm going to give you a little litmus test. Put a finger up for every question you respond yes to. And if you don't want to hold it up in front of the camera, that's fine. You can just count in your head, whatever you're comfortable with. So if you answer yes, you get a point. 1. Is there a miscommunication impacting at least one team member's ability to work more often than once every other week? 2. Is there at least one team member who regularly interrupts others in meetings? 3. Does your team have interpersonal conflicts more than once every other month? 4. Do disagreements, personal or professional, seem to go unresolved? 5. Is the general atmosphere in the organization competitive? 6. Does your team leader not include others in goal setting and decision making? 7. Does your team's turnover rate impact the organization's ability to function? 8. Does any member of your team miss deadlines more than once per month? 9. Does ineffective communication or teamwork impact the organization's sales? And finally, 10. Do your customers complain about the service they receive? All right, so each yes indicates a different area of emotional intelligence that may be lacking in a team. Think about your number. The greater it is, the more EQ gaps your team may be experiencing. Now, having one major gap can be more problematic than a half dozen smaller gaps. When it comes to EQ, it isn't about how many places it's missing so much as how sorely it's missing from those places. Please keep in mind that having EQ gaps is completely normal. Every team has at least a few. The question is it affecting your ability to function effectively as an organization? And if not now, will it in the future? Remember the top 5 EQ-related reasons that startups fail. Are those risks your team is running? If so, don't worry, because we're going to talk about solutions for organizational gaps in emotional intelligence. This is critical to understand in order to be efficacious as a leader, especially if you've identified with any of the problems we just discussed. There is a simple process for finding solutions to EQ gaps. First, identify the root problem. This is critical. We regularly experience the symptoms stemming from a lack of emotional intelligence. But when trying to solve the problem, you have to be able to name the exact culprit. This may be something like a lack of respect, communication skills, investment in the company, or difficulty with collaboration. Next, address this problem through employee development. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a great article on employee development from the HR perspective, but basically employee development means helping your team members to grow professionally and to develop new skills. So yeah, my computer really doesn't like having Zoom and anything else open. Oh, interrupting during Zoom meetings. Yes, that is, I've been hearing a lot about that. It's difficult because you can't read people's body language the same way. There's not a simple solution for it yet. We just really have to make Zoom better. So after you've addressed the root problem, focusing on employee development, you want to implement your solution and then have a way to measure the impact. If it was satisfactory, figure out how to keep that ball rolling. If not, consider alternatives. So here are just a small sampling of possible solutions to solve the EQ gap. This includes group EQ training, which usually looks like a couple-hour-long training focused on what the team as a whole needs. Independent EQ-focused coaching, which is more individualized, more meant to fill in the EQ gaps of a single professional, usually someone in leadership. Revamping communication structures, which can improve how the whole organization functions. And redesigning goals to get employee buy-in. Employee buy-in cannot be undersold. Oftentimes, as a startup grows, a founder will need to recalibrate their goals to get their employees invested, and that is absolutely fine. It does not equate to mission creep or anything like that necessarily. Whenever I start working with an organization to solve their EQ gaps, I start by conducting a needs assessment. That assessment directs me towards which solution is best for their context. There are many possible solutions. Knowing which one to use is hard, and with the critical impact of EQ on the workplace, guessing isn't always a risk worth taking, which is why I recommend talking to someone like me to find the right solution for your context. Getting an outside perspective can also be helpful with overcoming some of the obstacles to solving organizational EQ gaps. These include, but are not limited to, not knowing the best course of action to take, individuals' personal biases impacting implementation, limitation based on the hierarchy, meaning that if leadership is the problem, leadership may not be enthusiastic to solve the problem, and a general resistance to change. All of these can be tactfully approached from within, but sometimes it's helpful to have an external force to be the wind of change and prevent all core team members from having to be the bearer of bad news. All right, so now we're going to go into an example. I have had personal experience with being on a team that had emotional intelligence gaps. We were a team of 3 working on a software project, so we each had a fair share of responsibility. Due to my lack of skill with relationship management, we suffered greatly in the areas of communication and motivation, and ultimately were not effective or successful. It was easy to see from the behavior of the other team members that there was something wrong with my leadership, so what should I have done? Well, I could have taken a systematic approach to finding solutions to recurring problems stemming from these EQ gaps. I've worked up this graphic as sort of worksheet to guide users through developing these solutions. First, you want to identify your goal. In this scenario, I had a number of goals that I wanted to work towards. One was enabling better communication. Now, typically you'll want to set a SMART goal. SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time constrained. They're meant to be written in such a way that you can essentially answer yes or no when asked if you met them. I realize now that this is not on the slide. If you're not familiar with SMART goals, if you Google it, SMART goal, it's the first 100 things that come up will explain exactly how to write them. It's just a way to write goals that's a little more clear. So as this project dealt with tech development, one team member hitting a snag and giving up for the rest of the week until we met in person caused massive delays. I chose the goal, team members will communicate problems within 15 minutes of hitting a roadblock rather than at weekly meetings for the remaining duration of the project, which was specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time constrained. The root problem that caused the goal to be necessary appears to be ineffective communication, but that actually stemmed from a lack of mutual respect. Some members of the team believed their partners wouldn't be able to help them. Others believed that they would be shamed for running into problems. This is a respect issue because it related to our ability to respect one another professionally and to expect respect in return, which is a tongue twister. A possible solution would be to explain the goal, why it was necessary, and what steps to follow to achieve it. In this case, explain that when a problem arises, if it can't be solved independently within 15 minutes, to alert the whole team on Slack so that more heads can work on finding a solution, enabling the project to proceed faster. This is going to take some time to stick, so I allowed 2 weeks for full adoption. To assess the efficacy of this new policy, I would compare the number of problems reported during the week versus at meetings between these 2 weeks and the period prior. Were fewer problems being reported at meetings? Was more progress made on the overall project? If the answer was no, there didn't seem to be a positive impact, then the decision would have to be made regarding how to tweak the policy to improve it, or if it should be abandoned. If the answer was yes, then keep going. In the following weeks, introduce new policies to further improve upon weak spots. Okay, does anyone have any questions about this example? In that case, I was hoping that one person would be willing to volunteer a goal that they might consider setting for the emotional intelligence of their team, or a team they worked with in the past, or a fictional team, just an EQ goal that you'd be interested in working through this on. It doesn't have to be a SMART goal either. It can just be an inkling, if that's.
Maybe managing a team member who's difficult to work with, like if they clearly have issues, maybe even no one else on the team, but if there's someone who personally has communication issues.
Okay, so that's a little different because it's not a team EQ problem, it's an individual EQ problem. And so the solution to that would be more coaching focused than training focused. It would still fall under the category of employee development, but we can absolutely work through that. So, oh, it's not gonna let me type. It was letting me type yesterday. That's fine, I'll just talk through it. So let's say we have this coworker. In this scenario, let's say we're the manager, we're the founder, we're the CEO, we're somebody in charge, so we have the authority to take this action. And we have our coworker, Todd. And Todd is combative and doesn't really communicate clearly. Maybe it's not malicious, maybe it's just he's lacking a critical skill that helps people to understand him. So our goal, if we wanted it to be specific, if we wanted it to be a SMART goal, we would say something along the lines of Todd will, it would be dependent on the context. So I would need to know, I'm sorry, I didn't catch who spoke. Could you give me an example of what kind of communication problem you were referring to?
Yeah, well, one of them would be respectful communication, and then communicating needs. So instead of communicating needs at the appropriate time, it would be at an inappropriate time in an inappropriate way. And then also just respectful communication.
Okay. So when you're setting goals for an individual's character, essentially, because that's what respect comes down to, it's more appropriate to involve that person in the goal. So let's imagine we have Todd here with us and we're having a conversation with Todd. And we say, Todd, you know, we're getting a lot of feedback that people don't feel as though you respect them when you communicate with them in a certain way. And we make it clear to Todd that this is a problem and this is why it needs to change and this is what we're going to do to change it. And we all agree on that plan. And so our goal is Todd will communicate in a more respectful way. We would want to refine that to be a little more specific and measurable, but off the top of my head, that's what I've got for you. So at the root problem, it comes down to an issue of respect, which usually comes down to an issue of personal bias. Todd most likely carries biases towards different groups or individuals that prevents him from being generally respectful towards all. So the solution to that would be anti-bias and stigma training, most typically. And if it's just for an individual rather than for the whole organization, if we're to single Todd out, we would propose that he goes through coaching with somebody to do sort of, depending on what the specific issue is, maybe diversity, equity, and inclusion coaching, or just general anti-stigma and bias coaching, or maybe just communication skills coaching, depending on what exact outcome we're looking for. To assess the efficacy, we would look at his performance reviews at the 3-month, 6-month, and 12-month period. And over that period of time, be making changes to the structures we have in place for him to make sure that his needs are being met and that he's being supported in this journey of growth, which is what it is. As we run into problems, as we see that certain things aren't working very well, like maybe the coaching was going great, but then once the coaching stopped, he stopped doing it. Okay, so what other accountability metrics can we have in place? That kind of thing. And we just keep building on each learned step until we have achieved our goal. Todd is communicating more respectfully. Sorry, that was a little garbled. I hope that was clear. Does anyone have any questions about that example?
That was really helpful. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad. So if in the course of this workshop, you've come to realize that your team may need some further help in regards to their EQ gaps, worry not. It can be a difficult subject to bring up, but it is doable. If you're the sole person in charge, then congratulations, you can skip to the final step because you don't have to convince anyone else to try the solution. If you do need to get team buy-in, I recommend approaching the subject without pinning blame, i.e. not saying, Tim doesn't have social awareness, or Kelly consistently fails at self-regulation, or whatever the case may be. Rather use I language, like I think that our team as a whole would benefit from EQ training because, and then pull out the receipts. Have examples of EQ gaps that you've observed and how they've impacted the organization. Are customers complaining? Are team members leaving? That sort of thing. And have secondary evidence that illustrates the efficacy of EQ improvement as a solution. And once everyone understands where you're coming from, and sole decision makers, you can join us here, make the call to action. Go to the person in your organization who would be in charge of this type of initiative and invite them to pursue one or more of the solutions we've discussed. Does anyone have any questions on that? Okay. So that just about wraps up my presentation for today, but before we go on to closing questions, I just want to return to our learning objectives. Hopefully you feel that you've developed all 4 of these abilities, from identifying EQ to implementing it, to recognizing its absence, to finding solutions to improve it. Given that we only had an hour together today, I didn't get to talk about some other really interesting things regarding EQ in startups, such as directly mentoring others to develop EQ, preventing EQ gaps from appearing in your company, and writing EQ gaps out of organizational policy. If you want to talk about these or any other topics, like I said, please feel free to contact me. So we've got about 10 minutes left, I think, Emily. Does anyone have any questions? And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that I can actually see all your faces.
Can I just say you're amazing, Sam?
Thank you.
And it made sense, and you were direct, and you were, you didn't beat around the bush, and you really hit some incredible points. Being in 2 kinds of businesses, I can see this is really, really something to look at and study. Are you going to have some kind of a workbook? Are you going to have something that people could maybe possibly buy a pamphlet, a leaflet, a small book, something to, one, pass on to someone else, but also for your group to be able to read, to follow notes, to say, see where we're lacking, see where this mistake is, that you can, the different people in your group, your team, can refer to. Have you thought of doing something like that?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on the context. So when I work with an organization, I do provide materials, kind of like a workbook that they can go through with me to follow along during trainings to make sure that they're getting everything. Mm-hmm. And then also separately, I'm developing an array of online courses and webinars and different online programming so that individuals can come in and get whatever they need. And because it's self-paced, they can kind of get whatever out of it that they're trying to get out of it. But I will definitely look at the workbook idea.
So that would mean that, let's say you get your team together, if there's 2 of you or 3 of you, and you can have a personal Zoom with you. Do you belong, is it a course you have to take, or can it be on an individual basis, or have you, decided how you're going to do that?
So I do have a couple different models I follow, but I think it might be best if we discuss this after the webinar ends.
Of course.
So I will be happy to get into all the details with you later.
Yeah, no, and you don't have to. I mean, it's something that as a group, or everything that you join something, or that's what I'd like to know a little bit more about, because I think it's incredible. I think it's really right to the point in so many ways. So good for you.
Well, thank you.
That's awesome. With that, I did put the link to Sam's Shiner profile in the chat again. So this is your kind of second call to action to participate in the business shower portion of our event, in supporting Sam and her continued work and the growth of her company.